Hello, ladies and gentlemen of On the Line. I'm your host, Jen Gerson, and today I have Jean-François Adolphe Bélanger, recently married, assistant professor and defense analyst. He is an assistant professor of military operations at the Royal Danish Defense College, normally stationed in Copenhagen. He's also a research fellow at the NATO Defense College, and he's going to give us an overview. What exactly is going on with NATO? How are things within the alliance? Is Canada beginning to take its military situation seriously? And then we wrap up with a conversation about what's going on in the Arctic and what kind of threats we are concerned about up there. That's today on The Line.
This episode is brought to you by BioCanRx. If a drug is discovered in a Canadian lab and conducts successful clinical trials in Canada, there's a chance it will be launched in Canada. So how do we get more drugs out of Canadian labs and keep them here? This summer, The Line is partnering with BioCanRx, a federally funded Canadian not-for-profit research network, to learn about cutting-edge cancer immunotherapy research that they're helping Canadian researchers bring from labs to patients in clinical trials, all in Canada. Every year, around $500 million is spent on Canadian cancer research, but 70% of that is for early-stage work, discovering whether a therapy can do something in the lab. That leaves limited resources for the complex and often disjointed process of moving Canadian innovations from discovery to a clinical trial, and hopefully into the health system. BioCanRx has stepped into the gap. They specialize in translational research, the unsexy work that makes for boring press releases but gets results. 16 Canadian cancer immunotherapy clinical trials in just a decade, treating more than 400 patients. Thanks to this, BioCanRx has firsthand experience with the systemic disconnects that are trapping discoveries in Canadian labs or sending them out of the country to be developed. They have straightforward ideas about how to fix the problems. And spoiler alert, the answer isn't just add more money. Visit biocanrx.com to learn more.
So, Mr. Adolphe Bélanger, congratulations on your recent name change and marriage, and thank you so much for joining us on The Line.
Thank you very much. Happy to be here.
Great. So I'm going to dig right into it. I'm just wondering if you can, from your perspective, give us just a general overview of Canada's position in NATO, the state of NATO, and what some of our strategic strengths and weaknesses are right now. What are the things that Canadians need to be focusing on at present? So kind of a broad subject, and I'm just going to open the floor and just sort of allow you to give us a bird's eye view of what you're seeing right now.
Sure. Let's start. Let's turn the question around. I think it's going to be easier context-wise with the return of Donald Trump to the White House, which is a process that, before I get into it, is a process that had started way before Donald Trump started to want the allies to think up more for their security, be it in money and in troops and so on. The Obama administration, for example, wanted to withdraw some more troops from Europe, but the Crimea in 2014 changed everything when the Russians did the special operation to grab Crimea away from the Ukrainians. And when Trump came back to office, he came very, very hard with the European allies are not pulling their weight. They're not doing enough. We want to shift the burden of security away from the US because traditionally, after the end of the Cold War, a lot of the allies had cut down on spending when it came to defense and so on. The Americans, a lot of the security was all built on, if ever there's a conflict or there's a war, the Americans are going to come in afterwards as resupply, what's the word I'm looking for? Reinforcement, right? In order to do all of this. Now, there's the American line and there's the actual line where, yes, it's true that the Europeans had pulled back across the board on many things related to security. However, it was also great for the Americans who could dictate to the Europeans a lot more and have a lot more influence into their defense policies and so on. But now, with Donald Trump, we have this massive shift that is occurring where, on the one hand, the allies are spending more on defense, but they're also asked to take more responsibility. And when we talk about responsibility, we're talking more into the command structure. So the way that NATO's built, very rapidly for the listeners, you have the headquarter, which is the political dimension of NATO, where policy is made, where the strategic decision of the alliance are made, which is supported by options and so on from the strategic headquarter, which is in months, which is shaped. And then once something is decided, then this is sent back down to what we call the Joint Force Command, where the actual plan, how do we achieve the objective that we were given by the political level? This is all mapped out and put to paper there. And then what we call the execution. So if ever we need to put these plans into practice, like there's a war, and then we need to activate them, and then we need to send troops here and there, and how we do that, that's usually falling down to what we call the component command, which are like those second line. Now, in this whole reshuffling, what used to be a lot of American commands are now in European hands. So Norfolk, which is in charge of in primarily for Canadian interests of the North, has been given leadership by the leadership is now a British general. In Brusum, which is mostly for Europe and Central Europe, it's been given, if I remember correctly, to a German general, assisted by the Poles. And then Naples, which is the rest of the Mediterranean and so on, has been given, for example, to an Italian general. But also all of the troop requirements for everything that NATO needs to do and to put its family of plans. When I say family of plans, is basically the defense plans to put into effect, is meant to be done by Europeans. And I'm sure your listeners have seen it countless times. Every other week we get, well, the US are removing X amount of troops from Europe. The US is no longer going to give access to some of its air-to-air refueling capacity and so on. So
I just want to make sure that I understand that properly. So a lot of the actual leadership that is happening at sort of like the secondary and tertiary levels of the NATO alliance, that's been devolved to more and more European leaders. Is that in direct response to Donald Trump and his threats over the last year?
Yes, that's part of the burden shifting process.
Okay.
Yes, which is in large part driven by U.S. demand, right?
U.S. demand. Okay. So it's not it's not like NATO's taken the U.S. toys away. The U.S. has demanded that burden shifting, and the European militaries are stepping up. Okay.
Exactly. And then,
that all sounds.
Oh yes, I'll let you. I'm sorry.
That all sounds actually really positive. I think my question here is: do allied nations have a clear picture about what the U.S. actually wants? There was recently a tweet sort of thread by Elbridge Colby that basically said, I mean, my interpretation of it was, look, we want none of the responsibility but all of the power. We want to shift all of the burden to our allies, but we still want to be making the decisions, and we still want to force you to buy all your weapons from us. Is that
far off?
You're not
far off.
Okay. Not far
You're
off.
not far off.
Okay.
So
just checking.
What we know, right? I think you mentioned Colby Eldridge, and I think his most recent speeches, I cannot remember if I think he gave it at the foreign ministerials, because NATO, one of the big events that they hold every year is that there's all of the defense ministers of the alliance congregate at NATO HQ to discuss defense policy. And then afterwards, it's what we call the foreign ministerials, where Ministry for Foreign Affairs, or in Canada for Global Affairs, are converging to HQ to discuss foreign policy. But in the speech that he gave, he basically said that we want a NATO 3.0 that is a lot more like NATO 1.0. So that brings us to the 50s. And what happened in the 50s is that the Americans, sensing that they wanted to reduce their physical troop commitment to Europe after the war, and be able to reduce the amount of soldiers that they had, that's when they extended the nuclear umbrella to the alliance, right? Saying, we're pulling back troops, but we will defend the alliance with our nuclear weapons.
Right.
And at least to my sense, when I hear Colby Eldridge going at a 3.0 that looks like 1.0, it's starting to drastically sound like we want to go back at a time where the troops were Europeans, but the nuclear deterrent is American.
So basically,
Primarily American.
so the blood price is all paid by the Allies, and America contributes technological expertise and advancement.
I wouldn't put it exactly that way. I think you're quoting what was his name? Our former, he never made Michael Ignatieff in his book about Kosovo, right? That the American did the bombing and the Kosovo did the dying. But in this case, it's essentially the boots on the ground for an attack on Europe should be Europeans because it's European security.
Which doesn't strike me as an unreasonable ask.
It's not unreasonable. So I think the thing that many of us are struggling with is the way under which it's done. Because I mentioned earlier, it's been a process of about 15, 20 years now of the United States wanting to pull back from NATO. Well, not pull back from NATO, reduce their share of the spending and the troops, and then balance the sheet out, so to speak. Bush had done something similar. Obama had started to do something similar. The Crimea happens, and the Americans realized this is really not a good time to reshift burn in that way. So we're going to postpone that. And then Trump arrived, first mandate, very similar argument, convinced by a lot of his advisors not to push that way. There's famously that moment where what was the name of his chief of staff, John Kelly. And he said, as a businessman, I'm going to walk in there and I'm going to tell them that I quit, so that they'll finally believe that I'm serious. And John Kelly said, well, if you do that, I'm quitting this minute. This is not a business deal. This is international politics. And that's not how this works. And then we got Biden. We get the war in Ukraine. So NATO takes a role into supporting through procurement and various other ways to support the Ukrainian war effort. And then we have Donald Trump that comes back with everything that we know at the moment. So yes.
So what's different about the Trump approach here? Is it just tone?
It's not just tone. It's the best diplomacy is usually done in private, especially when you have to tell nations that you're dissatisfied with them, and that you want them to do more. Now, you do this for two reasons. Because at the end of the day, NATO is there and is meant to deter Russian aggression against Europe. But for deterrence to hold, and for the listeners, deterrence is a simple concept. At the beginning of it is stopping an adversary from doing something it wants to do. By a variety of means. Either you threaten to punish them, like to hurt them if they decide to go through with it, or you arrange your forces in such a way that you can deny them achieving whichever objective that they might have if they go through, right? So you just raise the cost across the board.
Right.
But this to be credible, you need to have a unified front. You need to have an outlook that everybody says, okay, yeah. And so that's why you have a tendency to not air these kinds of disagreements in the media or publicly, because there's an argument that says that it reduces the credibility of your alliance. If you're more influent and your stronger member says, well, I don't like Spain, they're not paying enough, so if Spain is in trouble, I'm not coming. So all of a sudden, there's a door that's open. Now, is it true? Or is it just blunder to get Spain to pay more? Put yourself in the shoes of an adversary, and that becomes fungible, because then depending on how much you value whichever objectives that you might have, your take on the situation may go from one to the other. And in this case, uncertainty, like it's not the right kind of uncertainty. And that's the main difference that we're seeing at the moment.
Another way of putting this might be leverage has a cost. So the cost of the leverage that Trump is using by engaging in this kind of public saber rattling or disrespect of the allies comes at the cost of a higher uncertainty of value. The higher the probability that an adversary might actually take him up on the offer, so to speak. So look, if I'm going to play devil's advocate here, I would say, okay, sure, but for the price of that increased uncertainty, Donald Trump's getting what he wants. He's getting everything that America has been trying to achieve for the last 15 years by your measure.
Sure. Okay, let's say for the sake of argument that I agree with you.
Okay.
And you'll see where I'm going with this. Okay. Maybe let's say that in the very short term, the United States are getting what they want. In the medium term, well, now it becomes a real problem. So we've already seen it with the Iran war. If all of this had been done in private, I am not so certain that countries because for Spain, for example, it was extremely unpopular to have the U.S. use their airfields, for example, to support the war effort in Iran. But now in a scenario where maybe Donald Trump would have been a lot more quiet in his way of doing this, well, then maybe the Spaniards would have tried to figure out a way to help a bit away from public eye so that they can politically be okay and support an ally. But in this case, they had no incentive to do it. And if we project ourselves in the future, what we're seeing right now, take a look at how the Germans, for example, are responding these days to American provocations in the media or American criticism. They are a lot more assertive than they used to be. 5 years ago, the kind of tone we're seeing from Germany would have been unheard of. Why? Because they're re-army. They have the ambition of becoming the strongest land power in Europe, and they're and they can do it, and they can make it there. It's an industrial force. By reshuffling a little bit and putting emphasis on industrial development for defense, they'll be fine. It will take time, take 5 to 10 years probably, but it will take time. But what you're having now is allies that are going to become a lot more assertive, because not only are they buying up their own means of defense, they will take less and less well, the word I'm looking for is probably not great for air, but they're going to have a shorter leash, let's say, when it comes to letting the United States pile up on them. And we're seeing that a little bit more with Canada as well, right? In the way the federal government is responding to the Americans, in the way that Canada, and you know what, let me jump right there. Canada historically was a bit less interested in NATO, although we always had an interest in NATO. But for everything that had to do with the North, we always said that it was a bilateral thing. We were not interested into having NATO in the North and into the Arctic. For us, it was bilateral. It was the integration with the U.S. through NORAD and through everything that we do over there. But now all of a sudden, for an America that says that North America is our playground as per that national security strategy, well, all of a sudden, one of the allies that was helping in this turns around and says, no, I mean, for the Arctic now, we need, it's a multilateral thing, and we cannot do it alone. Why? Directly leading from the US. So I think short term, yes, let's for the sake of argument, say that he got what he wanted, like Mark Rutte is saying, right? Like he got the allies to invest and so on. And I think the allies are getting what they want in a sense. In the alliance is not imploded. It's not great, right? And the relationship are going to be, I don't think they can be fully repaired down the line, but at least they're not unmanageable. But I think medium term, in terms of influence within the alliance, because you mentioned at the beginning, the United States are going to find it a lot more difficult. And more than that, I've been arguing a lot recently in these kinds of events that it's going to be untenable if the US want to maintain the same level of influence while having other allies pony up more of the money, the troops, and so on to make the alliance work. And more than that, what the US may not like is that the US do like a unified NATO, because when they need it, it's better for action. We've seen it in Afghanistan. But now when they pull back, we're seeing a bit more conflict arising between nations. Like it's a bit more difficult to get the nations to play along over some issues, which in the long run can be a problem. So short term, maybe. Let's say I agree. Long term, this is what in the field we call negative externality. It's not going to be a net positive for the Trump administration. I just don't think that. While I think that the strategist and the career diplomats realizes it, I don't think that the White House does.
Or they just don't care.
Either or.
This episode of On the Line is also brought to you by the Forest Products Association of Canada. Canada's forest products sector is not asking Ottawa to start over. The federal government has heard the advice, it has recognized the challenges, and it has put a plan on the table. Now the test is action. That means clearing made in Canada barriers, regulatory duplication, transportation bottlenecks, and uncertainty around predictable access to manage our forests. It means working with provinces to protect communities from wildfire risk and giving companies the confidence to invest here at home. Nearly 200,000 Canadians working in this sector are looking for results. The playbook is written. Now Ottawa needs to deliver. Learn more at fpac.ca.
I want to talk about the state of the alliance from your perspective, because I think this is really interesting. I'm sure you read it. There was a Wall Street Journal article that came out a few weeks ago explaining that, Mark Carney had been working for months behind the scenes to try and wake some of the European allies up to the fundamentally changed arrangement between America and the rest of the world. And initially, these overtures were not particularly well received until Greenland, was sort of what the reporting suggested. Once Greenland happened, that fundamentally shifted how a lot of Europeans are seeing and approaching America. And I don't think it's wrong to say that there are many people who have argued that threats around Greenland have broken a lot of trust in America's goodwill and capacity to serve as a world leader in a way that may not be reparable. What's your take on that?
I think the timing. I think the article got the timing right. I think the problem of Canada, and one of the reasons why maybe it was not well received from the European allies, was this, since the 90s, Canada's not shifting, but let's say that we did not uphold the promises that we put forward many times. Now, I think we also need to understand the difficult situation of a lot of the politicians in Canada when it comes to defense, because prior to Greenland and what we're seeing with the Americans right now, we are in a very enviable position. Defense-wise, we're surrounded by 3 oceans, one that's frozen. It's extremely difficult to attack Canada because of this, with a steadfast ally to the south with whom we had a fantastic relationship overall. So then try and tell your population that you need to make efforts and shift money from other programs and other priorities to reinvest it in defense. And for a long time, it was career suicide for most politicians that would try to really push a strong investment that way. But
I don't give Canada as much slack as you do, but that's fine. I mean, we at the line are pretty aggressive on Canada's lack of holding up its defense commitments, but fair point that we enjoy a peace dividend for sure.
Listen, by all means, keep them to account. Make sure that they put the money where they do, and I'm fairly critical myself, but I do think that there's one thing to understand. It's very important, is that the voter themselves have a responsibility when it comes to that. They have historically punished the Canadian government when it comes to procurement issues, right? The Harper government was punished over the F-35s. The Trudeau government, among other things, was punished over defense priorities. And we can go back like this. So that's why I think I'm conciliant, in the sense that I think the Canadian population also has a say into how Canada can and not, because at the end of the day, we're a democracy, and if voters don't like spending priorities, well, once we come to voting, then it changes things. All of this to say, I think Greenland was extremely traumatic, I think, for the alliance. It was taken extremely seriously. There was a report that came out, can't remember in which newspaper, saying that Denmark had sent blood and explosives to Greenland. You don't do that when you don't take a threat seriously. Then you may actually have to defend the island. It's coming from, because we had this idea, right, that we moved away from, especially among alliance and especially among democracies, from conquest as a mean to acquire what you want. And especially for the Danes, the 1951 treaty they signed with the United States essentially gave them gave the Washington a lot of rights when it comes to building building up their military presence there, right? So it was really what is going on, and on top of it, the justification that was given for Greenland made very little sense to anyone with two eyeballs that can look at charts and see, yeah, there's not really Russian and Chinese ships in the areas. Like the Russian did a nuclear exercise coming close to Alaska, but it was a bit nonsensical, I think.
So just to be clear, like I think the existing NATO agreement would have given America basing rights in the north of Greenland anyway.
It's not the NATO agreement; it's the agreement with Denmark.
Oh, sorry. Okay, with the agreement with Denmark, they already
have a bilateral agreement from 1951.
Okay, so America could have put a base up there if they were actually seriously concerned about this. I do want to get into the Arctic and the threat that the Russians potentially do pose to both us and the other Arctic nations in a minute, but the logic that Trump was using to argue for his expansionist aims scared the Allies. I think that's safe to say.
Yes. Well,
great.
I don't think it's a logic that was used. It's the fact that the Americans, in public, up until the Munich Security, was it Davos or the Munich Security Conference? I think it was at Davos or Munich. I don't know. Until then, that they did not rule out using force on Denmark, on Greenland, which is affiliated to Denmark under the governance agreement. Everybody realized what is going on, right? And that maybe that we need to be a bit more concerned about the aim of the Allies, but more than that, that we do need to take our security a lot more seriously, that the Europeans need to gang up, but also that smaller and medium-sized power cannot go it alone, right? Like that they do need a form of defense agreement to be able to support what they need to do. And it was, I think, decided, I would wager, not that I had private discussion on this, but I would wager that it's around that moment that what we like to call the European pillar plus Canada and NATO really formalized, and that the Allies decided, okay, this is going to be where our security happen, and this is going to be how it happens, and then why European allies became a lot more receptive to what Mark Carney said. And I think it's reflective a little bit of the in the most recent declaration in the Ankara summit, right? The wording and the wording of the European allies plus Canada, right? It gets very, very center under every single heading that, hey, we're taking care of business. We are, yes, all of the allies in Article 5, but we're also taking care of business. Sorry,
It does sound like there's a bit of a middle power containment strategy happening, where the middle powers of Europe and Canada are working on a kind of plan B, is the wrong way to put it. But if America does go pear-shaped, we need a security net, and Canada is in a bit of a strategically is it a geographically strong position to help with a containment strategy because of just our interdependence and proximity to the United States. Is that kind of how we're reading it here?
I don't know if I will go to containment, maybe, but there's certainly a series of hedging strategies that are being put together. We're seeing a lot of response to the United States that, okay, no, let me pull back, and I'll stay on what I know most. But the issue at the moment is that we cannot have the Americans fully disengage from NATO if we are the NATO allies, because they still provide technology and enablers that are crucial to the way NATO wants to fight and to fulfill the plan, mostly because the industrial base of Europe is not there yet to be able to replace piece for piece, or, as I argue elsewhere, the European allies have not yet figured out that they need to change the way that they will fight in the future to adapt their industry better,
But the
whether
word
you go
yet
on one way or
there,
another.
the word yet there is doing some work. Am I wrong?
Yeah, well,
'Cause
so I didn't want to go into like the super nitty gritty, but the NATO right now has the war fighting concept of NATO is called multi-domain operations. People, please go have a look. But all of this to say, it's a very digitally central concept where you need an awful lot of data in order to be able to fight in a what they call the speed of relevance, to fight faster than your adversary, to be able to take faster decisions in order to be able to achieve victory. And all of this
in
is based
in the
on
US.
some technologies that the European don't fully have and that are supplied by the US. And what we argued with my colleague Olivier Schmidt and Esben Larsing is fighting like the Americans without the Americans is a dead end and is not a good idea. So therefore, we need to rethink how we're going to fight in Europe with the means that we have in order to then be able to adapt our industrial capacity at the moment to move in that direction with the aspiration of being able to have like more technologically advanced, data focused kind of fighting, a little bit like the Ukrainians are doing, for example, with the Delta system and so on. So yes, it
So
does a lot of
I
yeah.
I want to get back to the word yet because I think that's a pretty crucial statement here. But I see there's kind of two strategic approaches to reducing dependence on America. One is, you build up your digital capacity and your digital technology in Europe. And then the second one is you re-embrace analog, right? I mean, both of these strategies can happen simultaneously. And then the third one is you also look to more non-conventional warfare like drones with, Ukraine leading the way on some of that. We've demonstrated that guerrilla warfare and more drone-based warfare are pretty capable approaches to dealing with a highly competent modern army. So there's that. And then I want to get back to your
Yes.
conversation around yet, because if NATO is not ready to exist without America right now, realistically, how long would it take for a NATO to exist without America?
So I think let's say that yet, and we'll go back to software-centric warfare
Okay.
argument. Um, most analyses that I've seen from people that I think are credible to change to basically put together the full array of what we need, especially the supply chains, the military mobility in Europe, and so on. I think we're talking probably between 5 to 10 years.
Oh,
But
that's
even
it.
then,
That's even by
yeah,
Canadian standards, I'm like 20 to 40 minimum.
no. Okay, let's be very clear, right? It's
That's
5 to 10 years.
optimistic.
It's 5 to 10 years minimum with sustained political will, right?
That's always the tricky part, isn't it? So 20 to
It's
40.
always the tricky part. Well, it depends. And again, the sad thing about this is the threat level is going to determine also the political will to keep on going, right? We can do incredible things when we believe a threat is imminent, when the population believes that a threat is imminent, and we shift resources in order to be able to achieve the goal while having a population that's ready to endorse, to support the hurt that comes with these kinds of policies, right? But again, what is the threat landscape going to look like in 5 to 10 years? It's open to interpretation. I think it will, in large part, matter how the Ukraine war ends and the state of the Russian armed forces, economy, and so on and so forth. By that point, it will modify. But let's make no mistake, right? The policy disagreement that Russia had with Ukraine and also with NATO is not going away. Because what the war ended up doing is reinforcing that, yeah, we did reinforcing Baltics being like, yeah, that was not a bad idea to join NATO, giving out Russia still settles its policy issues. Finland is, despite being unhappy about the speed of certain things, they're probably happy that they joined NATO and so on, right? So the issue is not going away. The time frame will depend a little bit as what Russia looks like at the end of the conflict, what Europe looks like, how credible the new the deterrence output of NATO is after all of the reshuffling, and whether the industries and so on, and whether, and I'm going to pivot to your question, whether we are getting the right lessons from Ukraine in the sense of what I think. Yes, Ukraine, when you look at Ukraine, you thought, oh, yeah, okay, we're kind of going back to the old days. Well, yes and no. When you in Ukraine, what's interesting is that the concept of the rear doesn't really exist anymore because of the drones, but also the level of connectivity and the speed at which data and targeting, because analyze and targeting is done. Right? Historically, when you look at a front line, you had your front line, and let's say 5 kilometers on each side, that was kind of a safe haven, so to speak. You could resupply, you could treat wounded, you can prepare, and so on. And at the moment, what they call the dead zone is about 25 kilometers on both ends, and more than that. Both of their territories is now subject to long range precision strike. So it's not only at the front line that the fighting's happening, or striking targets thousands of kilometers within. Well, it's more salient because of the size of Russia. Like the Ukrainians are able to strike targets 1,000 kilometers within Russian territory, right? And all of this is enabled by connectivity, data, and software. And I think and I am not a full expert on this, so I'm parroting a little bit what my very brilliant friends working on these issues are arguing. But they said the move that Ukraine did is that they put a lot of the complexity of warfare within the software so that they can invest in cheaper platforms, right? So that the means you use for war become a bit more disposable, but the heavy lifting is done within the software that analyze the data that comes in, figure out the target with precision, and allows to strike with precision. So it's a move away from what we call platform-centric warfare. For listeners, a platform's a frigate, like a ship. That's a platform, right? Whereas something that's a bit more. So, and looking at what Canada's buying at the moment, I am not fully certain we're buying into these lessons. And now that's not to say that we need to discard platform, because the Arctic is a different environment, and we will need some of this. And powering electrical device in the Arctic, for example, is difficult because of the cold. Anyone that has an electric vehicle understand that your batteries are becoming less efficient, for example. It's a lot more difficult and so on. But it's not to say that we should start looking into kind of a hybrid means there with conventional platform, and what kind of software and unmanned vehicles and so on could help us. However,
Okay, so
just very briefly on this one, just very fast. For people who are critical, if you look at the IDEAS website, which is the Departments of Defense kind of innovation hub thing where they're trying to get companies to co-solution, well, at the moment, Canada is asking for an alternative to Palantir. So
interesting.
So there's thinking. There's good thinking looking into that kind of future.
This episode of On the Line is also brought to you by Cameco Corporation. In nuclear energy, timelines and costs matter. Incomplete designs carry real risk of delays and cost overruns. That's why the AP1000 reactor is the right choice for Canada. It is already operating today and ready now to deliver the power we need, with 100% Canadian ownership and strong participation from Canadian suppliers. If we are serious about building Canada and powering it on time and on budget, the choice is clear. The AP1000 reactor is the only option that delivers. To learn more, visit ap1000.cameco.com.
This is what I'm curious about, because one of the debates that are that is happening this week is, look, Carney came to power. He was all elbows up. We have massively increased our spending into military kit. We're looking at increasing recruitment, doing all the things that we're supposed to be doing. But one of the fundamental questions I still have is how much of this is about actually creating a degree of sovereign capability, not necessarily opposing the United States, but independent to the United States? And how much of this is just a rework jobs program? Or
Yeah.
economic growth strategy? Like, how much of this is just us saying, look, we're going to spend X amount of dollars in defense, but then you start to dig into the details and it's all dual use infrastructure, or we're just using this as an excuse to spend taxpayer dollars on stuff that is important in politically sensitive writings, or it's got the patina of saying and doing the right things, but in fact, when you dig into it, actually we're becoming more integrated with the United States defense industrial base. It's like, what's your assessment of how serious we actually are on any of this?
Somewhere in the middle. So there's I'm not sure if they want me to out them on this, but there's two
No, they
very
do.
serious scholars.
We do need to out them on this. Out everyone.
No, I mean the paper is not in finished writing, so I don't want anybody scooping them. But my friend Justin Massy and his colleague Phil, I guess, are at the moment working on what does it mean, right? Like an independent sovereign capacity for Canada, right? So they're working on this. What I think Canada is realizing now is somewhere in the middle of everything we've been talking about is that we will, considering the size of our territory, considering our commitments, and considering where the threats might be coming from, it's great to think about a sovereign capacity, but nothing we will do will be outside of NATO, most likely, because we'll need allies. So therefore, the word of the day that needs to be more important is less independent and more interoperable.
Okay.
Meaning that we're capable of fighting with our allies in very similar fashion. And I think when you look as to why we went with the submarines that we went to, that's probably this kind of thinking that's operating. The reason why I haven't looked at the recent development for the millionth time that we're deciding that we might not want the F-35s. But I think it was Saab. We had discussions with Saab. Well, because of Sweden now being in the alliance, it's somehow an interoperable fighter. Although if I remember correctly, Saab's fighter jet have an American engine, but I need to be fact checked on this. But I think they do.
Yeah, they do. They do.
I think they do.
Although I think some of the other allies are working for workarounds on that one too.
Yeah. So, and the thing is at the moment, I think there's a dual track happening in the same time. We need to continue NATO's focus on, we need to be able to fight tonight. And we also need to, and this is in large part, and this is what has a lot of domestic issues, because try to explain to the French population that they should maybe invest into German submarines because they're a bit more advanced and we can get them faster. Like, these conversations are extremely difficult to have. And I'm not saying that is the case. I'm just giving an example at the top of my head. So you have this track, like, we need to fight tonight and we need to be able to sustain a conflict with Russia if it happens. But we also need to diversify and move away from American enablers, because we see that the current administration has used them as leverage in order to get what they wanted elsewhere. So we need to become more independent when it comes to this. And then the real question is going to be, what kind of strategy in the long run is the European and Canadian industry going to take when it comes to development? In an ideal world, everybody will kind of agree to, hey, this is our comparative advantage. This is our comparative advantage. We'll build this, you build out, and blah, blah, blah. But then somebody will raise their hands like, yeah, but what happens if it happens like the Americans? Oh, okay, now we need. So you can see like the devolving series of issues that we may have down the line looking at that. So, which is a long-winded answer to say, this is probably what explains the continued support of American product. Is first, they're available and they're useful, although a lot of nations are starting to question that, because I think it's Estonia that got some of their contracts pushed back for years now, say, hey, with the war in Iran, we can't fulfill this contract, so they'll want an alternative. And for Canada, well, there is a need, no matter what we do. And I'm not an economist, but a lot of what we do is intertwined with the U.S., especially when you look at defense in the Arctic. When you look at NORAD, we do the detection. Most of the analysis is done by the Americans. Takeaway that I would like to give to your listeners is a lot of these issues. You and I can summarize a lot of those probably in one sentence or two for a headline of a newspaper article or something like this. But realistically, these are extremely complex issues that have a lot of ramifications and lots of unintended consequences that we need to think through. And not only that, those decisions are taken by people whose job is only guaranteed in as much as they're voted in by their electorate, which compounds the issue.
Bloody democracies, so messy.
No, listen, I'm the first one to say, I do not want to live in any other system than a democracy. I love democracies. But we also need to understand that they come with some issues when it comes to these kinds of things. And if we're cognizant of this, but I think the reason why I say this is that one of the things that frustrates me a lot at the moment is that there seems to be a lack of courage when it comes to actually leveling up with population as to what we need to do for our security and defense, what it's going to take, and the expected cost in the short and medium term. Because there's going to be. And I think the Canadian population is receptive to this. I mean, we've seen it with the elbows up moment, with the response to Trump tariff, the response to like the 51 state threats. Like, Canadians are ready to pick up that burden. It's just that I think it needs to be explained in clear language. The strategic communication, so to speak, needs to be done. And the electorate needs to be told what the trade-offs are going to be and why we're doing these trade-offs and why inaction is going to be a problem in clear terms, that people that have little interest in defense, which I don't blame them, can also understand, because otherwise the only thing that is going to create is systemic resentment than voting for individuals that promise to actually disengage with these issues, which in the long run will probably prove to be less secure for the country. So we need to start the messaging yesterday morning.
Yeah, I mean, don't get me started on my frustration with the lack of strategic communications on ample display when it comes to the Canadian side. I think it's been a disaster. But that's another conversation. Last thing I want to talk to you here is, like, let's take the idea of America as a strategic adversary off the table for just a minute and talk about our known actual adversaries, China and Russia, and the threat that they pose to the Arctic. I mean, I know the Americans have stated very clearly and openly that they are deeply concerned about the Arctic. They're deeply concerned about Canada's seeming incapacity to defend it adequately. And they're concerned about, as the Northwest Passage opens up as a result of global warming, they're concerned about China and Russia engaging in those spaces. Are those legitimate concerns? What's your read on it?
I think it is legitimate concern. I mean, yes, the timeline is a bit broader than I think we expect. However, it is not a reason not to begin investing now in the proper infrastructure and so on to be able to defend the area. One thing that I think is a great exercise to do is, normally when you look at a world map, we depict North America, Europe, and Russia and Africa side by side. Yes, if you look at the map from the top, it's a different picture that emerged. One where you have Russia like this, and then you have North America like that, with the Greenland essentially being of kind of a vanguard of sort for the Arctic. Um, I'm not a climate expert. I cannot tell you the rate at which we expect the ice to melt and when we can expect a steady flow of ship. What I can tell you is that the Russians have been investing heavily into the North Sea Passage, right, in their own capacity when it comes to that. When it comes to China, I think the question is a little bit more muddied and is dependent on their relationship with Russia. Because we know that China has claimed themselves to be a near Arctic power. They have design on the Arctic, but a lot of it will need to go through collaboration with Russia that, as far as we can tell at the moment, the Russians are not necessarily willing to make. But depending on how Ukraine goes, for example, and maybe a potential conflict in Taiwan, it can reshuffle the cards. It's supposed to come out in a couple months now. I wrote with my wife actually a scenario as how what a search and rescue facility near the Bering Strait could look like if Russia and China begins to collaborate, because the search and rescue allows you to dock boat and land planes, right? So it's kind of portrait with another name. Is it realistic at the moment? It's probably very low probability, but it's the kind of scenario that we could see emerge depending on how some of the pieces we have on the checkboard, so to speak, reshuffle. But yes, the Russian are an Arctic power. They want to be able to project power there. So we need to be ready for that. We need to be able to be ready to keep our freedom of movement when it comes to it, and to be able to deny access if we need it to, right?
On what time frames are we looking here? Like, we're not looking at the Russians aren't going to make a play for the Arctic in the next 6 months. But maybe this is something we need to start. But maybe this is something we need to start worrying about in the next 6 years, 60 years. Like, what's the framework we're looking through here?
That's an excellent question. I would say, from what again, this is not my sphere of expertise. What I've seen, we're probably looking at something like a 15 to 20 years issue. We'll need, please fact check me on this one.
Okay.
But
I'm going to say, look, let's not take this totally at face value. We're just gonna we're throwing spaghetti at a wall here so that we have an understanding of.
Let's say it's a medium term problem.
Medium term problem. Okay.
Medium term problem. However, building infrastructures in the Arctic is not like building infrastructure downtown Toronto. I had a contractor once tell me, who had built stuff in the Arctic, that said, you basically need to, before you can build, you need to build a Home Depot with you. Because if you're missing 3 screws, you cannot go to the store to get them. So the logistics to be able to build these infrastructure is massive. And it's also to figure out where they need to be and so on. But case in point, when you look at the map and you look at Russian architecture in their portion of the Arctic, and you look into built infrastructure in Canada, the difference is stark. And if I remember correctly, we only have 1 railroad that goes north. I think it comes through Manitoba. I can be wrong, but I think we have 1. So, and we know that moving things that the military might needs more than 1 railroad. So, yes, but the threat is, and I know you want to talk about this, sadly, I will need to go. This is the principle why I wrote that piece about the Golden Dome, saying that Canada should consider it if we have command power within it, because realistically, the security problems in the Arctic, before anything else, will come from deep strike if we ever get there, which our detection system will be necessary to find, and also we'll need to have the means to be able to strike it down. And it will be great to have stay in that. However, If it's us spending money to join a system in which we have no command decision, well, it's not that much different than not spending money in a system that we have no command.
Decision. Yeah, that makes sense. So look, I just want to sum up what my understanding here is that Arctic, yes, the risk is real. It is a medium-term risk. But that being said, because of the logistics of the Arctic, if we are to take that seriously, we need to start moving now in order to address that seriously. We were talking about Golden Dome. This is sort of like the North American equivalent of the Iron Dome system. This is something that we should be looking into and taking seriously, the idea of the ability to strike down sort of long-range missiles. But we shouldn't just be throwing money at the Americans to build this for us. If it's going to be our money, we should really be the ones with the significant control over how it operates.
You don't even need me. This is perfect.
I clearly do. All right. Well, you have to go back to enjoy your lovely new wife. And again, congratulations.
Yes,
Thank you so much for taking some
go
time
help
to
my
chat.
mom put up her new blinds in your new house. So I need to be able
Fantastic.
to go be a good son.
Mr. Adolphe Bélanger, thank you so much for joining us. I really enjoyed this conversation, and I think it just gave us a really beautiful overview of the situation from a military and strategic point of view, and I hope that our audience also enjoyed it. If you haven't already, do come check us out at www.readtheline.ca, and if you haven't already, like and subscribe. The buttons are below. Thanks so much, and thank you again.
You're welcome.